Imagine walking through a zoo where the animal cages held not lions and tigers, but terrified human beings. Now imagine those humans weren't prisoners. They were refugees being protected in plain sight from one of history's most murderous regimes. In 1939, as Nazi tanks rolled into Poland, one man made an unthinkable choice that would save hundreds of lives. The director of the Warsaw Zoo, Jan Żabiński, and his wife Antonina transformed their bombed-out animal enclosures into a secret network of human hideouts. But how did a simple zookeeper manage to hide over 300 Jews right under the noses of Nazi officers who frequently visited the grounds? By the end of this story, you'll discover how a daily parade of garbage carts actually smuggled Jews to freedom, and why the piano playing of Antonina Żabińska meant the difference between life and death. Warsaw, Poland. September 1st, 1939. The city was a vibrant European capital, home to the largest Jewish population in Europe outside of the Soviet Union. Over 350,000 Jewish citizens lived and worked in Warsaw, nearly a third of the city's population. The Warsaw Zoo was one of Europe's most magnificent housing exotic species from around the world, in spacious natural enclosures designed by its visionary director, Jan Żabiński. A scientist and zoologist by training, Jan ran the zoo alongside his wife Antonina, who had an almost supernatural ability to communicate with and calm wild animals. Their villa on the zoo grounds was filled with a rotating cast of orphaned or injured animals they were rehabilitating. Lynx cubs sleeping in the bathtub, badgers under the bed, and their son Rizard's best friend, a baby camel named Bessie. For the Żabińskis, the zoo wasn't just a collection of animals. It was a model for a more perfect society, where creatures of all kinds could live in harmony. Jan was a practical man of science, but he was also an idealist who believed deeply in the preservation of all life. The couple's home functioned as a salon for Warsaw's intellectuals, with scientists, artists, and writers gathering regularly to exchange ideas. Among them were many prominent Jewish academics and professionals who had become their dear friends over the years. They could never have imagined that within days their paradise would become a hell, and their professional sanctuary for animals would need to be repurposed to save human lives. The world the Żabińskis knew ended at dawn on that September morning when the Luftwaffe appeared in the skies above Warsaw. The German Air Force unleashed a merciless bombing campaign that shattered the city. The zoo, with its large open spaces, became an immediate target. Bombs fell directly on animal enclosures, killing countless creatures instantly. Others, maddened by fear, broke free from their damaged cages and ran wild through the streets of Warsaw. Jan watched in horror as his beloved elephants trumpeted in terror before collapsing under a hail of shrapnel. Tigers, bears, and exotic birds lay dead or dying. Those animals that survived the initial bombing faced an even crueler fate when Nazi soldiers entered the zoo for hunting parties, shooting the remaining exotic creatures for sport. Within weeks of the invasion, Jan and Antonina faced an impossible choice. The Nazis had declared the damaged zoo would be closed, the surviving valuable animals shipped to German zoos, and the remaining ones slaughtered. The couple was told they could stay in their villa on the grounds, but the zoo itself was finished. It was in this moment of devastating loss that Jan conceived of a dangerous idea. If the zoo could no longer protect animals, perhaps it could protect people. As Warsaw's Jewish residents were being forced into the newly established ghetto, Jan approached his old friend Janusz Korczak, a Jewish pediatrician and orphanage director, with a whispered proposition. "The cages are empty now. Perhaps we can fill them again." What the Nazis didn't realize was that the Warsaw Zoo had something most other locations in the city lacked: an extensive network of underground tunnels, empty animal enclosures, and hidden basement spaces designed for animal housing and storage. Jan Żabiński had been appointed as the superintendent of the city's public parks by Warsaw's mayor, a position that gave him extraordinary access to the Jewish ghetto under the guise of tending to the small public gardens inside. Each time he entered, he would smuggle out as many Jews as he could hide in his truck, concealed beneath piles of garbage, waste, and rotting vegetation supposedly collected from the ghetto gardens. The Germans, disgusted by what they perceived as Jewish filth, rarely inspected these malodorous loads. Back at the zoo, The human cargo would emerge at night to be hidden in plain sight, in cages once occupied by pheasants, empty animal pens converted to sleeping quarters, or the labyrinth of underground tunnels that connected various parts of the zoo grounds. The Żabińskis called their rescue operation the House Under a Crazy Star, but they had a code name for those they rescued: guests. Each guest was given an animal name to use while in hiding, a subtle psychological trick that Jan believed helped everyone remember they were no longer operating in the human world of names, identity papers, and social standing. They were now creatures in hiding, dependent on camouflage and instinct for survival. The villa itself became known as the Villa of Secrets, where up to a dozen people might be hiding at any given time in cleverly disguised compartments. A wardrobe in the bathroom concealed a tunnel entrance leading to underground chambers. The piano in the living room sat above a basement hiding space where families huddled in darkness. And in perhaps the most audacious hiding place of all, Jan transformed the empty monkey house, visible from the street and from Nazi guard posts, into a shelter by covering its barred windows with dense vegetation and creating a false back wall that concealed a living space. Life at the zoo settled into a perilous routine of calculated risks. The family maintained a show of normalcy, even hosting German officers on occasion. Antonina, drawing on her experience calming frightened animals, developed a warning system. When Nazi officials visited unexpectedly, she would sit at her piano and play a specific melody, Offenbach's Go, Go, Go to Crete, a signal for everyone to remain absolutely silent and still. When danger passed, she switched to playing Chopin, and life could cautiously resume. The guests maintained strict discipline, never flushing toilets during the day, speaking only in whispers, and moving about only in the deepest hours of night. Children were given sleeping pills during dangerous periods to ensure their silence. One Jewish infant was hidden for months in a tiger's abandoned cage, tended to by Antonina as if she were an exotic animal being rehabilitated. Meanwhile, Jan's position overseeing the city parks provided the perfect cover for resistance activities. He converted the zoo's animal transport trucks to smuggle weapons into the ghetto and people out. He stored munitions in empty animal feed containers and used his official papers to move freely around restricted areas of Warsaw. The zoological records room became a forgery workshop where identity papers were created for Jews being smuggled to safer locations. Even the zoo's preserved animal specimens played a role. Hollow taxidermied animals became hiding places for documents, jewelry, and other small valuables that escaping Jews needed to finance their survival. Former zookeepers, now unemployed, were recruited as lookouts and messengers, carrying coded communications disguised as notes about non-existent animals still in the collection. The risk of discovery loomed constantly. Nazi officers frequently conducted spot checks of the zoo grounds, as they suspected the large property might harbor resistance activities. One afternoon, a German soldier noticed a movement in what was supposed to be an empty fox enclosure. Jan, thinking quickly, explained they were raising rabbits there as food, a lie that was accepted only because he immediately offered to kill several as a gift for the German officer's dinner. On another occasion, Antonina found herself giving a tour of the villa to an SS officer, while a Jewish family hid silently in a space beneath the guest bathroom, covered only by a thin rug. The officer remarked on strange noises coming from below, which Antonina attributed to the pipes of their troublesome pre-war plumbing system. Each day brought new dangers, new guests, and new impossible decisions about who could be saved and who must be turned away. The winter of 1941 brought new horrors to Warsaw as the Nazis tightened their grip. The ghetto walls grew higher, rations decreased, and typhus spread through the overcrowded Jewish quarter. Jan's trips into the ghetto became increasingly dangerous as German guards grew suspicious of his frequent visits. Yet the need had never been greater. Each day he witnessed the deteriorating conditions: children with swollen bellies from starvation, elderly people collapsed in the streets, and the daily collection of bodies that could no longer be properly buried. Through his underground connections, Jan learned of the Nazis' final solution long before most Poles understood the true purpose of the trains leaving Warsaw. This knowledge made his mission all the more urgent. He began focusing on saving Jewish intellectuals, scientists, and artists, people whose knowledge and cultural contributions might otherwise be permanently erased. He smuggled out the renowned sculptor Magdalena Gross by hiding her in a garbage truck beneath actual animal waste from the few remaining zoo creatures, then concealed her in his home for months, where she continued to create small sculptures from scraps of materials. The Żabiński's young son Ryszard, only 10 years old when the war began, became an integral part of the rescue operation. Nicknamed Little Fox for his keen senses and natural stealth, the boy served as a lookout and messenger. He memorized the patrol schedules of German guards and developed an uncanny ability to spot plainclothes Gestapo agents. The boy also helped feed and care for their guests, carrying food to hidden Jews in the underground chambers by pretending to feed non-existent animals. He learned to mimic animal sounds as signals. The hoot of an owl meant danger approaching, while the call of a woodpecker indicated the coast was clear. On several occasions, Ryszard guided new arrivals through the zoo's grounds under cover of darkness, teaching them to move silently like the predators that once inhabited the cages. In one heart-stopping moment, the boy narrowly avoided detection by diving into an empty bear pit when German soldiers unexpectedly entered the zoo grounds during his rounds, lying motionless under dead leaves for 3 hours until they departed. By 1943, the zoo operation had expanded beyond the Żabiński's original network. Underground resistance cells throughout Warsaw knew the zoo as a temporary safe haven, a way station for Jews being moved through the Underground Railroad to rural hiding places or out of Poland entirely. The villa's basement became a classroom where Jewish children were taught Polish traditions, Catholic prayers, and non-Jewish mannerisms, skills essential for survival if they were to pass as Christian Poles with their false identity papers. Antonina, despite her gentle nature, became adept at the dangerous art of transformation, teaching frightened Jewish women how to walk, speak, and carry themselves like non-Jewish Poles. She coached them on Catholic customs and helped them memorize false personal histories down to the smallest details. Your survival, she would tell them, depends not just on your papers, but on believing so completely in your new identity that you dream as this new person. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April 1943 marked a turning point. As Jewish fighters made their last stand against Nazi forces, the Żabiński's operation faced its greatest challenges. The streets swarmed with German reinforcements, checkpoints multiplied, and informants motivated by rewards hunted for hidden Jews. At the zoo, every guest had to remain completely silent for days, venturing out of hiding only in the deepest hours of night to stretch cramped limbs. Jan, who had joined the armed resistance by this point, disappeared for weeks during the uprising, returning with bullet wounds and more desperate refugees. During this period, Antonina ran the entire operation alone, 7 months pregnant with their second child and suffering from tuberculosis that had developed due to the stress and poor wartime nutrition. Still, she managed to maintain the facade of normality while orchestrating the movement of dozens of people through their property, all while caring for her son and preparing for the birth that would come amidst the chaos. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Żabiński's rescue work was the sense of humanity they maintained throughout. Unlike many hiding places where Jews were confined in attics or cellars for years without fresh air or movement, the zoo offered moments of near normality. On rare, carefully selected nights when no German patrols were nearby, Antonina would invite their guests out of hiding for impromptu gatherings in the villa. She would play the piano while Jewish musicians among them joined in with whatever instruments were available. Scientists and professors gave whispered lectures on art, literature, or science. For brief hours, the victims of Europe's greatest atrocity could reclaim their humanity through music, knowledge, and shared meals. One survivor later recalled, "In the villa for precious moments, we were not rats in hiding, but human beings engaged with beauty and ideas. This was Antonina's greatest gift to us, not just saving our bodies, but preserving our souls." The most ingenious aspect of the Żabiński's operation was how they weaponized the Nazis' own prejudices against them. German officials considered the abandoned zoo a wasteland, a sad reminder of peacetime frivolity now properly destroyed in wartime. They viewed Jan as a harmless academic, too concerned with animals to pose any threat, and Antonina as simply a housewife and mother. This underestimation became the Żabiński's greatest advantage. When suspicious neighbors reported strange noises from the zoo grounds, Jan explained them as the sounds of the few remaining animals or feral dogs that had taken up residence in abandoned enclosures. He even invited German officers to hunt these pests, strategically directing them away from areas where people were hidden. The couple deliberately cultivated an image of eccentric but apolitical zookeepers mourning their lost animals. Jan kept meticulous records of the few creatures still in their care, detailed feeding schedules, health reports, and breeding plans, creating a paper trail that suggested his mind remained firmly fixed on zoological matters rather than resistance activities. These records were actually coded messages about the humans in their care, with animal names serving as aliases for their Jewish guests. The monkey house became the operation's most daring hiding place. Visible from the street, yet offering excellent concealment, its interior was divided into two sections by a false wall. The front portion housed a small pig breeding operation, a legitimate food source that provided both cover and sustenance. Behind the false wall, up to 15 people could hide in the former monkey enclosures, now fitted with crude bunks and ventilation systems disguised as animal enrichment structures. The Nazis' revulsion toward pigs, which they associated with uncleanliness, made the facility an unlikely target for thorough searches. German soldiers would rarely venture past the entryway, repelled by the stench and satisfied that the building's purpose was purely agricultural. One Jewish mathematician lived in this space for over 2 years, using his confinement to solve complex equations scratched into the concrete with nails. His work, smuggled out by Jan and shared with other scientists in the underground, would later contribute to early computer programming advances after the war. The psychological toll of living in constant fear affected everyone at the zoo. Antonina developed a sixth sense for danger that manifested physically. Her hands would tremble uncontrollably before German patrols arrived, often giving her precious minutes to warn their guests. Her diary, kept in code and later recovered, revealed the immense strain. "I live in two worlds. In one I must appear casual, motherly, untroubled. In the other, I count heartbeats between guard rotations and measure success in breaths held during searches." The guests suffered too from prolonged confinement. Children who had already witnessed unspeakable horrors in the ghetto now faced months of enforced silence and immobility. To preserve their sanity, Antonina created what she called life classes, silent activities where Jewish children could draw, read borrowed books, or watch the remaining zoo animals through hidden peepholes. These glimpses of nature and normalcy became lifelines for traumatized young minds. One survivor, a girl who was 9 when hidden at the zoo, later recalled, "The elephant house became my school. From a tiny window I watched the seasons change, counted birds and drew pictures of the outside world. Mrs. Żabiński said I was studying the zoology of freedom." The network supporting the zoo operation grew increasingly complex as the war progressed. A local Catholic priest provided baptismal certificates for Jews who needed Christian documentation. Underground printers created forged ration cards. Sympathetic Polish doctors certified false medical conditions that exempted guests from labor roundups once they left the zoo with their new identities. Even German soldiers occasionally played unwitting roles. A Wehrmacht officer with a passion for entomology regularly brought Jan rare insect specimens, never realizing that his visits were timed to coincide with the movement of Jews through the property, providing perfect cover for unusual activity. The officer's vehicle parked in front of the villa deterred random searches by other German patrols. By mid-1944, the Żabińskis' rescue operation had expanded beyond their property. They coordinated with other safe houses throughout Warsaw, creating emergency evacuation plans for their guests if the zoo became compromised. Jan mapped sewer routes leading from the zoo to other hiding places and cached emergency supplies, food, medicine, and false papers at strategic points throughout the city. As the tide of war slowly turned against Germany, the danger paradoxically increased. Desperate Nazi officials intensified their hunt for Jews in hiding, offering increased rewards for information. The price on a hidden Jew's head rose to 3,000 zloty, more than 3 months' wages for an average Pole. Denunciations increased as collaborators sought to profit or curry favor with the retreating regime. The Żabińskis faced heightened scrutiny when a captured resistance fighter under torture revealed that the zoo was part of the Underground Railroad. German officers searched the property twice in June 1944, but found nothing. The hiding places were so ingeniously designed, and the guests so well disciplined in silence, that even thorough inspections failed to detect them. During one search, 12 people hid inside the hollow base of a large defunct animal scale, breathing through straws inserted through nearly invisible holes drilled in the metal. The officers actually rested on this scale during their search, complaining about having to waste time investigating the obviously harmless zookeeper. Antonina, 7 months pregnant with their daughter Teresa, served them tea with hands that shook not from fear, but from carefully controlled rage, as the men sat unknowingly atop their hidden guests. The most harrowing period for the Warsaw Zoo sanctuary came during the Warsaw Uprising of August 1944, when Polish resistance fighters launched an all-out revolt against Nazi occupation. As fighting engulfed the city, the zoo found itself dangerously close to the front lines. German artillery positions were established just 500 yards from the villa, with shells frequently landing on the zoo grounds. The underground chambers that had provided safe haven now threatened to become tombs, as bombardments weakened structures and collapsed tunnels. Jan made the agonizing decision to evacuate most of their guests through sewers to safer districts, knowing that movement during the fighting carried its own terrible risks. Those too weak or too recognizably Jewish to move remained hidden in the deepest underground chamber beneath the Elephant House, a reinforced concrete room originally designed to store dangerous animals in quarantine. 7 people lived in this 15 by 15 foot space for 28 days during the heaviest fighting, with air coming through a single ventilation pipe disguised as a damaged drain. Food and water reached them only when Ryszard could crawl through debris under cover of darkness, navigating by memory through passages now partially collapsed. The uprising's failure brought new terror as Nazi forces enacted collective punishment on Warsaw's population. The Żabińskis themselves were finally forced to flee when German demolition teams began systematically destroying all remaining structures in the city. With only 30 minutes warning from a sympathetic German biologist who admired Jan's pre-war research, the family managed to evacuate their remaining 5 guests by disguising them as part of a convoy of wounded Polish civilians being transported to a rural hospital. Antonina, now heavily pregnant, was separated from Jan during the evacuation. He joined a partisan unit operating outside the city, while she and Ryszard were interned in a refugee camp in Łódź, 70 miles from Warsaw. Even there, remarkable courage prevailed. Antonina managed to keep a Jewish infant with them, passing the child off as her niece despite the danger of discovery. The baby had been born in the zoo's birdhouse to a mother who died during childbirth. With no documentation and distinctly Jewish features, the infant faced certain death if identified. Throughout their internment, Antonina maintained the deception, even convincing a German doctor to treat the baby for pneumonia without examining the child too closely. The zoo itself was obliterated in the final Nazi scorched earth campaign against Warsaw. German engineers detonated explosives in all remaining structures, collapsing the underground network and destroying decades of zoological work. When Soviet forces finally drove the Germans from Poland in January 1945, less than 10% of Warsaw remained standing. The Żabiński family returned to find their life's work reduced to rubble. The villa was heavily damaged, but remarkably still standing, its basement hiding spaces exposed to open air where walls had collapsed. Of the once magnificent zoo, only scattered concrete foundations remained. Yet amid the destruction, they found small miracles. A cache of documents hidden inside a hollow elephant statue remained intact, containing the real names and false identities of many they had saved. More astounding was the discovery that 2 elderly Jewish sisters, too frail to be evacuated during the uprising, had survived in a forgotten storage chamber beneath the bison enclosure, subsisting on preserves stored there before the family's forced departure. The women had endured 3 months alone, believing the entire world above might have perished. The immediate post-war period brought both reunion and reckoning. Jan returned from partisan fighting, reuniting with Antonina and their children in March 1945. Their daughter Teresa, born during their separation, was already 3 months old when her father first held her. The family began the painful process of accounting for those they had protected. Of the more than 300 Jews who passed through the Warsaw Zoo during the war, they could confirm that approximately 200 had survived until liberation. The others had been captured during transport to other locations, killed during the Warsaw uprisings, or had disappeared into the chaos of war, their fates unknown. The true miracle was not just how many had been saved, but that the operation had never been discovered, despite its extraordinary scale and duration. Not a single guest had been captured at the zoo itself, a testament to the Żabińskis' meticulous planning and the discipline of everyone involved. Equally remarkable was that the family had accomplished all this without financial gain. Unlike many who hid Jews for exorbitant payments, the Żabińskis never accepted money, operating purely from moral conviction. When refugees arrived with valuables they hoped to exchange for sanctuary, Antonina would simply say, "We house humans, not treasure," though she would sometimes safekeep their possessions until after the war. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Żabińskis' story is how thoroughly it was initially forgotten. In the communist Poland that emerged after the war, their heroism received no official recognition. The Warsaw Zoo was eventually rebuilt, but with no commemoration of its wartime role. Jan returned to his zoological work and writing, publishing over 50 books on animal behavior, zoo management, and popular science. Antonina raised their children and assisted with his research, neither of them speaking publicly about their wartime activities. It was only in 1965 when the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Yad Vashem began formally recognizing righteous among nations, non-Jews, who had risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust, that the Żabińskis' story emerged. Former guests who had scattered around the world after the war came forward with their testimonies, painting an extraordinary picture of courage that had remained hidden for decades. Jan and Antonina were awarded the honor in 1965, with the official citation noting the unprecedented scale of their rescue operation and its unique use of a public institution as cover. Still, the full extent of their activities remained largely unknown outside of Israel until the early 2000s, when a researcher discovered Antonina's coded wartime diary in a Warsaw archive, finally bringing their remarkable story to global attention. The Żabińskis' rescue network extended far beyond the zoo grounds, encompassing an intricate web of collaborators throughout Warsaw. Local veterinarians provided medical care to ill or injured guests under the guise of treating the few remaining zoo animals. Pharmacists prepared medications without asking questions when Jan appeared with unusual requests, insulin for a research monkey that was actually a diabetic Jewish physician, or morphine for a dying lion that was needed for a woman who had given birth in hiding. Restaurant owners slipped extra food into the family's orders, knowing without being told that the Żabińskis were feeding more than just themselves. Even the zoo's maintenance staff, officially laid off but secretly still receiving small payments from Jan's Parks Department budget, served as lookouts and message carriers. Most remarkably, several German scientists who had visited the zoo before the war and maintained professional correspondence with Jan became unwitting accomplices. These zoologists and botanists, sending scientific journals and specimens as professional courtesies, provided perfect cover for Jan's continued academic activities while simultaneously supplying desperately needed items concealed within their packages, radio components hidden inside preserved animal organs, or microfilm containing escape route information sandwiched between pages of botanical illustrations. The psychological methods the Żabińskis employed to maintain morale among their guests revealed their profound understanding of both human and animal behavior. Antonina, drawing on her experience rehabilitating traumatized zoo animals, recognized similar patterns in the people now under her care. She instituted what she called normalcy rituals, small daily activities that provided psychological anchoring amid chaos. Jewish children in hiding were assigned simple responsibilities, tending to the family's canaries, watering plants, or organizing the day's food rations. These tasks gave purpose and routine when everything else had been stripped away. For adults suffering from the helplessness of confinement, Jan created intellectual challenges. A renowned mathematician continued his research on prime numbers using paper from old zoo ledgers. A poet composed verses that Antonina memorized and later transcribed when paper became available. A watchmaker repaired the villa's clocks and taught Rizard the fundamentals of mechanical engineering. Through these activities, the guests remained connected to their former identities and skills, preserving not just their lives, but their sense of human worth. What truly distinguished the Warsaw Zoo operation from other rescue efforts was its remarkable success rate and duration. From October 1939 until the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944, nearly 5 years of Nazi occupation, the zoo functioned continuously as a rescue hub without detection. This longevity was no accident, but the result of Jan's scientific mind applied to the problem of human concealment. He analyzed German search patterns and patrol schedules with the same methodical precision he had once used to study animal migration routes. He created maps of the zoo grounds marked with time-stamped German movements, identifying safe corridors that changed hourly. For each hiding place, he calculated maximum capacity, air supply duration, and sound propagation patterns. This analytical approach extended to human psychology as well. Jan studied the individual German officers who regularly visited the parks department, identifying those with exploitable weaknesses. One officer's enthusiasm for chess was cultivated into regular matches with Jan, games strategically scheduled to conflict with surprise inspection times reported by resistance sources. Another officer's interest in exotic plants led Jan to develop a rare orchid collection, requiring specific greenhouse conditions that coincidentally made thorough searches of the area difficult. Even the family dog was trained to perform different greeting behaviors for welcome and unwelcome visitors, providing subtle advance warning of potential threats. The ethical dimensions of the Żabiński's choices reveal a profound moral clarity that transcended the compromised values of their time. When asked years later why they had taken such extraordinary risks, Jan replied with characteristic directness, "When you look into the eyes of an animal, you know exactly where you stand. It is the same with humans in extremis. All pretense falls away, and you see only the essential need. How could we look into those eyes and turn away?" This zoologist's perspective, seeing the common thread of life connecting all creatures, formed the philosophical foundation for their rescue work. For the Żabińskis, the distinction between saving a wounded eagle and saving a hunted human was one of degree, not kind. This ethical framework extended to their treatment of Germans as well. Despite the brutality they witnessed, they maintained a remarkable ability to distinguish between the Nazi system and individual Germans. When a wounded German soldier collapsed near the zoo entrance in 1943, Jan provided first aid before turning him over to authorities. An act of humanity that later created valuable goodwill when that same soldier was assigned to requisitions oversight for the parks department. This nuanced moral compass guided the family through situations where the line between resistance and collaboration often blurred, allowing them to work within the system just enough to subvert it, while never crossing their own ethical boundaries. The story of the Warsaw Zoo's transformation into a human sanctuary challenges our fundamental understanding of heroism. The Żabińskis did not fit the traditional mold of resistance fighters. They carried no weapons, sabotaged no trains, assassinated no officials. Yet their quiet subversion saved more lives than many armed resistance cells. Their weapon was the power of a created environment. They engineered a physical and psychological space where the hunted could disappear in plain sight. This environmental resistance represented a uniquely zoological approach to the problem of human survival. Just as animals in the wild use camouflage and adapted behaviors to survive predation, the Żabińskis taught their guests to adapt to a new ecosystem where different rules applied. They understood that survival required not just hiding places, but a complete transformation of movement patterns, vocalizations, and social behaviors. Jewish intellectuals who had never performed manual labor learned to convincingly act as groundskeepers. Concert pianists trained their hands to appear work-roughened. University professors practiced the speech patterns and posture of illiterate laborers. This total environmental approach to resistance, creating not just hiding places, but complete alternative ecosystems for survival, represents the Żabińskis' unique contribution to the history of Holocaust rescue operations, a methodology born directly from their understanding of how animals adapt to hostile environments. The most dangerous moment for the Warsaw Zoo operation came in February 1943, when an unexpected Gestapo raid threatened to unravel everything. A German informant had reported suspicious activity, multiple people entering the zoo grounds, but never leaving. On a frigid morning, 5 Gestapo officers arrived without warning as Antonina was feeding the family's rabbits. Inside the villa and various hiding places throughout the property, 17 Jews were concealed, the most they had ever sheltered simultaneously. What unfolded next demonstrated the extraordinary preparation and quick thinking that characterized the Żabińskis' operation. Antonina, spotting the approaching officers, played Offenbach on the piano, the danger signal that froze everyone in place, then calmly greeted the Germans at the door. Rather than appearing nervous, she invited them in from the cold, offering coffee and cake, explaining that her husband would return shortly from his Parks Department duties. This unexpected hospitality momentarily confused the officers who had expected to conduct a hostile search. As they warmed themselves in the living room, directly above a basement hiding place where 7 people lay motionless, Antonina engaged them in conversation about the challenges of wartime food production, gradually steering the discussion toward the rabbit breeding program visible from the window, a program that was providing essential protein for Warsaw hospitals, including German military facilities. When Jan arrived home to find Gestapo vehicles parked outside, he immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Rather than appearing defensive, he enthusiastically welcomed the officers, apologizing for his absence and offering to show them the zoo's innovative food production facilities, the rabbit hutches, the mushroom caves developed in former bear dens, and the pig breeding operation in the monkey house. His scientific enthusiasm and apparent eagerness to demonstrate how his work supported the German war effort created a compelling diversion. As he led the increasingly bored officers through carefully selected areas of the zoo grounds, he pointed out the difficulties of maintaining the crumbling structures, the constant battle against rats that threatened their food production, and the challenges of winter feeding. The senior Gestapo officer, having found nothing suspicious and now thoroughly cold and disinterested, cut the tour short. Before leaving, however, he mentioned their informant's report about people disappearing into the zoo. Jan, without hesitation, explained that resistance members had indeed been using the perimeter of the zoo grounds without his knowledge, slipping through the damaged fencing to move between city districts while avoiding checkpoints. He expressed outrage at this violation and requested German assistance in patrolling the boundaries, effectively repositioning himself as an ally concerned about the same security breach. This masterful redirection succeeded, but the close call forced the Żabińskis to implement even more sophisticated security measures. They accelerated their rotation system, never keeping most guests longer than a few weeks before moving them to other safe houses with new identities. They established a 3-tiered hiding system, emergency hiding places that could be reached in seconds, but would only withstand cursory searches, intermediate hiding places that could sustain occupants for hours during thorough inspections, and deep hiding places virtually undetectable but with limited air supply, reserved for the most dangerous situations. They also intensified their counterintelligence efforts. Richard began dropping false information in public places about resistance activities in other parts of Warsaw to draw attention away from the zoo. Jan cultivated relationships with clerical workers in German administration offices who could warn him about scheduled inspections. Antonina started hosting small musical gatherings for off-duty German officers, seemingly cultural evenings that were actually intelligence-gathering opportunities where wine loosened tongues about upcoming security operations. This layered security approach reflected Jan's scientific methodology, each potential threat pathway analyzed and multiple redundant countermeasures implemented. What made the Żabińskis' operation particularly effective was their understanding that physical hiding places alone were insufficient. Their guests needed psychological preparation for survival. Antonina developed what might now be recognized as an early form of stress inoculation training. New arrivals underwent a simulated search procedure their first night at the zoo, learning exactly how to respond to different types of German inspections. They practiced moving silently through escape routes while blindfolded, developing muscle memory that would serve them if they needed to move in darkness. Children were conditioned gradually to remain silent during stressful situations through a series of games that rewarded quiet endurance. Adults received coaching on how to manage panic responses, controlling breathing, mentally reciting memorized texts to prevent fearful thoughts, and using pressure points to stop spontaneous physical reactions like coughing or sneezing. This psychological preparation proved as valuable as the physical hiding places when real dangers emerged. During one actual search, a 3-year-old girl remained perfectly silent for 4 hours, later explaining that she had been playing the statue game Mrs. Żabińska taught me, turning a terrifying experience into a challenge she had been prepared to meet. By early 1944, the Warsaw Zoo operation had evolved beyond its original scope into a comprehensive underground railroad that moved people through a series of safe houses before final placement in rural locations or with resistance groups. The Żabiński's role expanded to include document preparation, identity coaching, and placement assessment. Jan developed a systematic evaluation process for each person in their care, analyzing their appearance, speech patterns, education level, and physical capabilities to determine the most suitable false identity and placement. Those with clearly Semitic features who couldn't pass as ethnic Poles even with altered papers were moved quickly to remote rural hideouts. Those who could assimilate visually but lacked the cultural knowledge to pass scrutiny were paired with Polish families who could provide intensive cultural coaching. The most convincing cases were sometimes placed in plain sight, working as shop assistants or even in one remarkable case as a secretary in a German administrative office. The zoo became the central node in this classification and distribution network, with Jan applying the same taxonomic rigor he had once used in zoological research to the problem of categorizing degrees of passing privilege and vulnerability. This systematic approach maximized survival chances by matching each person to the hiding strategy most likely to succeed given their individual characteristics, a methodology that recognized the reality that in Nazi-occupied Poland, survival opportunities were tragically unequal, and resources had to be allocated based on objective assessment of success probability. The culmination of the Warsaw Zoo's role as a sanctuary came during the most devastating period of the Nazi occupation, the systematic liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. As the final roundups began, desperate parents pushed children through sewer grates and gaps in the ghetto wall, hoping strangers on the other side might save them. The Żabińskis, through their underground connections, became a key destination for these orphaned children. In a 2-week period during May 1943, they temporarily housed 27 Jewish children, none older than 12, before dispersing them to convents, rural families, and resistance-connected orphanages throughout Poland. These children arrived traumatized, often having witnessed their parents' murders or experienced extreme violence. Many had survived for weeks, hiding in crawl spaces or attics before making harrowing escapes through the sewers. Antonina created what she called a decompression chamber in the zoo's former veterinary clinic, a space where these children could transition from the nightmare of the ghetto to their new hidden lives. Here they received medical attention, psychological care, and critical training in Catholic prayers and customs needed for their false identities. The children's ability to adapt astounded even the Żabińskis. One 8-year-old girl, having watched her entire family shot in their apartment, arrived at the zoo mute from trauma. After 3 days of Antonina's gentle animal therapy, allowing the child to feed rabbits and care for the family's cats, she began speaking again, though only in whispers. Within 2 weeks, this same child had memorized enough Catholic prayers and Polish cultural references to be placed with a rural family as a niece from Lwów, where she survived until liberation. The technical sophistication of the Żabińskis' operation revealed Jan's scientific ingenuity applied to human survival. The zoo's animal hospital became a laboratory for identity transformation. Here, Jewish physical characteristics that might attract dangerous attention were altered using techniques borrowed from both theatrical makeup and veterinary medicine. Hair was dyed using formulations originally developed to change the coloration of exhibition animals. The distinctive nose shapes that Nazis had caricatured as Jewish identifiers were temporarily altered using wax prosthetics designed by a former theater makeup artist now in hiding with the Żabińskis. Most ingeniously, Jan discovered that tannic acid, used pre-war to prepare animal skins for preservation, could temporarily darken pale skin typically associated with indoor scholarly Jewish life to more closely resemble the weather-worn complexion of Polish field workers. These physical transformations complemented the cultural coaching that prepared hidden Jews to inhabit their false identities convincingly. A systematic protocol was developed for each person. Physical appearance modification first, followed by wardrobe assembled from donated clothing, then intensive language coaching to eliminate Yiddish accents or scholarly speech patterns, and finally, immersion in Polish Catholic practices. This comprehensive transformation process typically took 2 weeks, a dangerous investment of time that paid dividends in long-term survival rates for those who completed it. Of those who underwent the Żabińskis' full identity conversion process, nearly 90% survived the war with their false identities intact, compared to an estimated 10% survival rate for Jews in hiding throughout occupied Poland. The intelligence gathering that supported the zoo operation demonstrated Jan's systematic approach to resistance. He maintained detailed records on German personnel rotating through Warsaw, their routines, weaknesses, interests, and prejudices, all disguised as zoological research notes. These records proved invaluable when specific Germans needed to be avoided or occasionally cultivated for protection. Jan's position with the Parks Department gave him access to municipal information that revealed patrol patterns, checkpoint changes, and areas of intensified surveillance. He created a network of informants throughout Warsaw's infrastructure, trash collectors who observed German movements while being virtually invisible to them, utility workers who could move between restricted zones with proper work orders, even waiters at restaurants frequented by German officers who reported on conversations. This human intelligence network was complemented by Jan's own analytical work. He maintained detailed maps of the city, marked with arrest patterns, raid frequencies, and informant activities, identifying hot and cold zones for moving his hidden charges. The precision of this intelligence operation was demonstrated during a particularly dangerous transfer in November 1943, when 8 people needed to be moved from the zoo to a rural safe house after a nearby arrest raised concerns about increased scrutiny. Jan plotted their journey to avoid 3 known checkpoints and timed their movements to coincide with a visiting Wehrmacht general's tour of Warsaw, correctly calculating that security forces would be diverted to protection duties rather than random searches. The ethical framework that guided the Żabińskis' decisions throughout their rescue work reflected a philosophical depth rarely discussed in Holocaust rescue narratives. When food shortages became severe in 1944, the family faced impossible choices about resource allocation. With their own children sometimes going hungry, questions arose about how to distribute limited food among their hidden guests. Antonina established what she privately called hunger rotation, a system where adults would voluntarily fast for 24-hour periods on a rotating schedule so that children, pregnant women, and the elderly would always have minimum nutrition. This approach transformed resource scarcity from a competitive scenario into a cooperative one where sacrifice was equally shared. The Żabińskis applied similar ethical principles to their selection of who they could hide. Unlike some rescuers who only accepted those who could pay or had valuable skills, the Żabińskis used a different calculus. Those in greatest danger and with fewest alternatives received priority, regardless of their resources or potential usefulness. When space was limited, they made agonizing choices based on vulnerability rather than utility or connection. This ethical framework extended to their treatment of informants as well. When they identified Poles who had betrayed hidden Jews for Nazi rewards, their response was not vengeful violence, but a sophisticated disinformation campaign, feeding these individuals false information about hiding places that would lead German raids away from actual refugees while discrediting the informants when their tips proved worthless. The psychological toll of maintaining the zoo operation manifested in ways the family rarely discussed publicly. Years later, Reisard revealed that his mother developed a form of compartmentalized identity. The warm, seemingly carefree woman who charmed German officers and maintained household normalcy was entirely different from the exhausted, fear-racked woman who emerged when they were safely alone. She suffered from insomnia throughout the occupation, sleeping only in brief intervals and developing a hypervigilance that persisted decades after the war. Jan processed the strain differently, becoming increasingly methodical and emotionally detached, treating rescue work like a scientific problem, requiring objective analysis rather than emotional response. He developed what he called ethical mathematics, a private calculation of risk versus result that helped him make impossible choices about who could be helped and who turned away. Their son Reisard, bearing responsibilities no child should carry, developed his own coping mechanism, a detailed memory palace where he stored critical information that couldn't be written down, mentally organizing floor plans, patrol schedules, and contact protocols like a human computer. The family never sought psychological help after the war, considering their trauma insignificant compared to what Holocaust survivors had endured. Only in his 80s did Reisard begin speaking about the nightmares that had haunted him throughout his life, dreams where the sounds of German boots on gravel approached endlessly while he tried to warn hidden families who couldn't hear his cries. The full scope of what transpired at the Warsaw Zoo remained largely unknown to the world for decades after the war. When Jan and Antonina returned to rebuild their shattered lives in 1945, they did so in a Poland transformed by communist rule, where Western connections were viewed with suspicion and Jewish rescue narratives did not align with the government's preferred emphasis on Polish national suffering. The Żabińskis themselves, traumatized and focused on rebuilding the zoo, rarely spoke about their wartime activities. Jan resumed his scientific research, publishing widely in zoological journals, but never mentioning his most remarkable achievement, the application of zoological principles to human survival. The family maintained contact with many they had saved, but these relationships remained private, conducted through coded correspondence and occasional discreet visits. It was only when some of their guests who had emigrated to Israel began sharing their testimonies with Yad Vashem that the extraordinary story began to emerge. Even then, under communist rule, the Żabińskis could not travel to Jerusalem to receive their Righteous Among Nations medals, which were delivered quietly to their Warsaw apartment by an Israeli diplomat in 1965. The ceremony attended only by family and a few trusted friends, rather than receiving the public recognition it deserved. The reopened Warsaw Zoo initially contained no acknowledgement of its wartime role. Visitors wandered past rebuilt enclosures unaware they stood on ground where human beings had once hidden among animals. The villa, restored and again serving as the director's residence, gave no indication of the false floors, hidden chambers and secret tunnels that had once housed hundreds of fugitives. Jan continued as zoo director until 1951, when political pressure from the communist regime forced his resignation. His Western scientific connections and independent thinking marked him as ideologically suspect. The family remained in Warsaw, but Jan's career shifted to teaching and writing, while Antonina raised their children and occasionally assisted with his manuscripts. Their son Reisard followed his father into zoology, eventually becoming a civil engineer and architect, designing wildlife habitats that incorporated principles of concealment and protection he had witnessed firsthand as a child. Their daughter Teresa, born during the family's wartime separation, became a physician, perhaps influenced by the medical challenges she had heard about from her parents' wartime experiences. The family legacy continued in quiet, productive lives that gave little external indication of their extraordinary past. The physical evidence of the Warsaw Zoo rescue operation has largely disappeared. When the zoo was rebuilt after the war, safety concerns and limited resources meant that most of the underground structures were filled in rather than restored. The tunnels that had connected animal houses to the villa were sealed, the false walls dismantled, the hiding places integrated back into normal rooms. The monkey house where so many had hidden was completely demolished, replaced by a modern structure with no connection to its historic role. Only the villa remained as a tangible link to the past, though renovated multiple times over decades. It was not until 2009, following the publication of Diane Ackerman's book, The Zookeeper's Wife, and the subsequent film adaptation, that the Warsaw Zoo finally created a small permanent exhibition acknowledging its wartime history. Today, visitors to the villa, now a museum, can see photographs of Jan and Antonina alongside testimonials from those they saved, though the physical spaces of hiding remain largely invisible, their exact locations uncertain after decades of reconstruction and renovation. Archaeological work continues at the zoo, with researchers occasionally discovering physical evidence: a hidden compartment behind a bricked-up fireplace, a section of tunnel uncovered during utility work, tantalizing fragments of an underground human sanctuary that once existed among animals. What makes the Warsaw Zoo story so remarkable is not just the number of lives saved, but the philosophical foundation underlying the rescue effort. Jan Żabiński, asked years after the war why he had risked everything to save strangers, responded with the perspective of a scientist who had devoted his life to studying all forms of life. To this day, people ask why we did it. I find the question strange. You see an ant drowning, you reach to save it. Why? If you save a man, you don't ask yourself why, you just do it. My wife and I followed the voice that told us we were doing the right thing. In the eyes of those we helped, in their fear, their hope, I saw the same spark of life I had seen in the animals I had cared for. All living beings deserve protection from cruelty. It was as simple as that. This zoological humanism, the recognition of the fundamental sanctity of all life, represented the Żabińskis' unique contribution to Holocaust rescue efforts. In their worldview, the artificial boundaries between human and animal suffering dissolved, replaced by an ethical imperative to protect the vulnerable regardless of species. The Warsaw Zoo, designed as a sanctuary for endangered wildlife, found its highest purpose as a sanctuary for endangered humans, a transformation that honored the deepest meaning of conservation. The legacy of the Warsaw Zoo rescue operation extends far beyond the lives directly saved. When survivors and their descendants gathered in Warsaw in 2015 for the 70th anniversary of the zoo's liberation, they represented more than 3,000 people alive today because of the Żabińskis' courage. Doctors, teachers, artists, scientists, and ordinary citizens whose existence would have been erased if not for a zookeeper and his wife. Beyond these living legacies, the Warsaw Zoo story has transformed our understanding of resistance during the Holocaust, challenging the false dichotomy between passive victims and armed fighters. The Żabińskis embodied a third path, what Holocaust scholars now term humanitarian resistance, the assertion of human dignity and moral values in direct opposition to Nazi ideology without the use of violence. This form of resistance, once overlooked in Holocaust narratives focused on ghetto uprisings and partisan actions, has gained recognition as equally significant in understanding the full spectrum of responses to genocide. The Żabińskis' example demonstrated how professional expertise, in their case zoological knowledge, could be repurposed as a resistance tool, inspiring research into how doctors, engineers, teachers, and others used their specialized skills to save lives during the Holocaust. Their story represents not just individual heroism, but the creative adaptation of scientific knowledge for human survival. The Warsaw Zoo story has become a powerful educational tool precisely because it defies simplistic narratives. Neither Jan nor Antonina fit neatly into heroic stereotypes. They were complex individuals whose courage coexisted with fear, whose certainty about saving some lives came alongside agonizing choices about who could not be saved. Jan's scientific detachment helped him create systematic rescue protocols, but sometimes made him seem emotionally distant, while Antonina's empathetic nature sustained their guests psychologically, but left her crippled with anxiety that persisted long after the war. Their story offers no clean moral resolution, no triumphant moment when their sacrifices were publicly validated during their lifetimes. Instead, it presents the messy, complicated reality of moral choices made under impossible conditions, the compromises, the errors in judgment, the moments of weakness alongside extraordinary courage. Holocaust education has increasingly embraced this complexity, using the Żabiński's story to explore how ordinary people made extraordinary moral choices without the benefit of hindsight or certainty about outcomes. Students today analyze Jan's ethical mathematics, his calculated risk assessments about who could be saved, as a way to understand the impossible moral dilemmas faced by rescuers with limited resources and unlimited need. The scientific dimensions of the Warsaw Zoo rescue operation have inspired contemporary approaches to humanitarian work. Jan's methodical analysis of hiding spaces, security vulnerabilities, and psychological preparation has been studied by modern humanitarian organizations designing refugee safe houses and evacuation protocols. His systematic approach to creating false identities, analyzing physical characteristics, speech patterns, cultural knowledge, and psychological readiness to inhabit new personas has influenced witness protection programs and refugee resettlement strategies. Antonina's techniques for helping traumatized children recover through animal-assisted therapy and normalcy routines anticipated approaches now standard in psychological treatment of young survivors from war zones. Perhaps most significantly, the Żabiński's integration of scientific knowledge with humanitarian action prefigured today's emphasis on evidence-based approaches to human rights interventions. Their work demonstrated that effective humanitarian action requires not just compassion, but specialized knowledge strategically applied, a lesson that continues to shape rescue operations in contemporary crisis zones from Syria to Myanmar, where modern-day Żabińskis apply professional expertise to protect the vulnerable. The Warsaw Zoo today honors its unique history in ways both symbolic and substantive. A small museum in the restored villa educates visitors about the property's wartime transformation, featuring photographs, testimonials, and archaeological findings from ongoing excavations of hiding places. The Żabiński Awards recognize Polish conservationists who demonstrate an ethical commitment to protecting both wildlife and human rights, linking the zoo's dual legacy of animal conservation and human protection. Perhaps most meaningfully, the Warsaw Zoo has established a sanctuary program for rare animals rescued from war zones in Syria, Ukraine, and Gaza, a modern echo of its wartime role, providing refuge for the hunted and vulnerable. The current zoo director, when asked about this initiative, explained, "We see this as honoring the Żabińskis in the most appropriate way. They understood that the boundary between human suffering and animal suffering is artificial, that compassion must extend to all living beings caught in humanity's conflicts." This philosophy represents the enduring legacy of Jan and Antonina Żabiński, the recognition that the true measure of humanity lies not in the artificial boundaries we construct between species, but in our capacity for empathy across those boundaries. In the empty cages of a ruined zoo, they created a sanctuary that affirmed the value of all life, a testament to the human capacity for moral courage that continues to inspire more than 80 years later. Their story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hour, when cruelty becomes policy and indifference the norm, individuals can still choose compassion, a choice that ripples through generations in the lives of those saved and in our collective memory of what remains possible in the face of overwhelming evil.